He pitied his frail human mate, until she slaughtered the invading Alpha King before his entire pack. It wound through the black skeleton forests of the Ashenvale foothills like a wound that refused to heal, narrow and treacherous, glazed with black ice that caught the pale afternoon light and threw it back in cruel, mocking glints. The escort of 6 Lycan outriders rode ahead of the covered wagon, without speaking, their breath coming in heavy plumes that dissolved almost instantly in the biting cold. They were massive men, each of them, with the particular density of muscle that distinguished wolf-blooded warriors from ordinary soldiers, and they rode with the absolute, unconcerned ease of creatures who had never once feared the dark pressing in between the trees. Inside the wagon, wrapped in 3 layers of traveling furs, Frail sat perfectly still with her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap and her pale grey eyes tracking the tree line through a gap in the heavy canvas. She was cataloguing the outriders, their formation spacing, the way the largest one, Riding Point, occasionally tilted his head fractionally to the left when he caught a scent on the wind, the precise angle of the short axes they wore across their backs, and whether those axes were balanced for throwing or for close work. From the outside, anyone observing the young woman tucked inside the wagon would have seen exactly what Earl Brennick Coldemore had spent 4 careful months cultivating. A small, fragile creature of aristocratic pallor and anxious stillness, with a sharp collarbone visible above her traveling cloak, and eyes that skittered away from direct contact with any of the escort wolves. She had flinched beautifully when the lead rider's horse had reared at a shadow near the ford crossing. She had pressed a handkerchief to her mouth and turned away when one of the wolves had casually snapped the neck of a rabbit that had bolted across the road, holding it up with a grin that showed too many teeth. She had performed every note of the role her father had written for her, with complete, unhesitating precision. She had been performing it her entire life. Duskfang Hold revealed itself at dusk, which Frail suspected was by deliberate design, some ancient alpha's understanding that the fortress made its most devastating first impression at that particular hour. It rose from the black granite cliff face, like something that had always been there and simply chosen to become visible. A tiered mass of dark stone towers and deep-arched ramparts, with torchlight burning amber in every window and along every battlement walk. The Ashenvale River, not yet fully frozen this early in the winter season, roared white and savage through the gorge below the outer walls, and the sound of it, combined with the howl of the mountain wind threading through the towers, created a low, bone-deep resonance that most humans interpreted as dread. Frail felt her pulse steady and slow as the wagon rumbled across the massive stone bridge. She was assessing sightlines, exit routes, the depth of the gorge below. The great gates of Duskfang Hold were opened without fanfare. The Lycan court of the Ashenvale Mountains did not perform ceremony for human brides. They were waiting in the main courtyard, perhaps 40 of them, the inner court of the Duskfang pack. They were arrayed in a loose, predatory cluster that had the appearance of casual gathering and the reality of deliberate assessment, every pair of eyes fixed on the wagon as the outriders brought it to a halt on the frost-hardened stone. Frail could feel the weight of their collective attention pressing against the canvas sides of the wagon like a physical thing. She arranged her expression into wide-eyed, trembling anxiety, took 3 rapid, shallow breaths that made her chest hitch visibly, and waited for the wagon door to be opened. Draven Ashcroft, Alpha King of Duskfang Hold, was not what she had expected. She had studied every account of him available in her father's library, which was substantial, because Earl Brennick Coldemore was a man who researched his weapons thoroughly before he deployed them. The accounts universally described a man of terrifying physical presence and absolute, uncompromising authority. What the accounts had failed to capture adequately was the quality of his stillness. He stood apart from his court, 2 paces ahead of his assembled wolves, and he was not performing dominance the way lesser alphas performed it. He simply occupied space in a way that made everyone else's occupation of space seem provisional. He was tall, considerably over 6 feet, with the dark hair and slate-grey eyes common to the old bloodlines of the northern packs, and a jaw that looked as though it had been carved from the same granite as his fortress walls. He wore no crown. His authority required no such announcement. He was dressed practically, in heavy dark wool and leather, a great charcoal-colored fur cloak hanging from his broad shoulders, and the only ornamentation on his person was a single band of hammered silver on his right hand, the mark of a bonded alpha. His eyes found her immediately as she stepped down from the wagon, and she saw it happen in his face. She had seen it happen in the faces of every person she had ever deliberately deceived. That small, involuntary softening, that unconscious recalibration toward gentleness, in the presence of something perceived as fragile. She allowed herself one stumble on the cobblestones. Just one, carefully calibrated. His hand came out before she had even registered the motion, steady and immediate, gripping her elbow and righting her. "Careful," he said. His voice was precisely as deep as the accounts had suggested, but she had not anticipated the absence of condescension in it. It was simply a word, a practical word. "Careful." "Thank you, my lord," she breathed, looking up at him, with eyes she had widened to their maximum capacity. She allowed her lower lip to tremble almost imperceptibly. "Forgive me." The road was very long. Something moved in his expression that she filed carefully away for later examination. It was not contempt. It was not the calculation she had expected from a man who had accepted a human bride primarily as a treaty mechanism. It was something considerably more inconvenient. It was pity. Behind the alpha, she heard a woman's voice, low and dry. "She is smaller than the report suggested." "Thessaly." Draven's voice carried a note of quiet warning without turning around. The woman who stepped forward to stand at his left shoulder was everything Seraphel was pretending not to be. She was nearly 6 feet of barely contained predatory energy, with close-cropped dark red hair and amber eyes that performed exactly no social softening whatsoever. She looked at Seraphel with the frank, measuring gaze of someone pricing livestock. "Lady Seraphel." Thessaly's greeting carried the precise minimum courtesy required by protocol and nothing beyond it. "I am Thessaly Vaughan, Beta of Duskfang. I will show you to your chambers." She made it sound like a sentence. "That is very kind," Seraphel murmured, allowing her gaze to drop deferentially. As she followed Thessaly through the great iron-banded doors of the keep, Seraphel kept her eyes low and her steps small. She was memorizing the layout of the entry hall, the position of the guard posts, the angle of the inner staircase, and the precise location of every exit. The chambers assigned to her were generous by any standard. A suite of 3 interconnected rooms in the east tower, with a massive fireplace, heavy tapestries depicting scenes of the ancient wolf wars, and a narrow window that overlooked the inner training yard. The window was what mattered. She spent the first 3 nights cataloguing the guard rotation in the training yard by moonlight, while appearing, to any servant who might enter unexpectedly, to simply be unable to sleep, sitting by the cold glass with a book open on her lap and a candle burning low on the sill. Draven came to her chambers on the 4th morning, alone, which surprised her. He knocked. That surprised her more. He stood in her doorway with a covered tray bearing bread, soft cheese, dried fruit, and a small flask of heated cider, and he looked profoundly uncomfortable, which was an extraordinary thing to witness in a man of his dimensions. "The kitchen staff inform me," he said, with the careful delivery of someone choosing words with great deliberateness, "that you have eaten very little since your arrival." Seraphel set down the book she had been reading and rose from her chair with a small, grateful flutter that she had practiced until it felt entirely involuntary. "My lord, you did not need to trouble yourself. You are my responsibility," he said, and there was nothing proprietary in it. It was simply a statement of his own internal code. He set the tray on the table near the fire and seemed briefly uncertain what to do with himself after that. "Please," Seraphel said softly, "will you sit with me for a moment?" I confess I find the silence of the tower rather large. He sat. He was clearly not accustomed to sitting in chairs designed for human proportions, and he negotiated the carved wooden chair across the table from her with a certain practical resignation that she found, to her considerable annoyance, humanizing. They sat in an odd, quiet companionship while she picked at the bread, and he rested his forearms on the table and occasionally glanced at her with the specific expression of a man attempting to determine whether a bird he had found with a broken wing was going to survive the winter. "You are cold here," he said eventually. "It wasn't a question." "I am adjusting," she replied carefully. "I will have more firewood brought." He said it with the tone of a man solving a problem, the only language he appeared to be entirely comfortable in, and stood. "If there is anything else that would make the keep more tolerable, you will tell Thessaly, and she will see to it. You are very kind, my lord." He paused at the door, and she saw him search briefly for something to say that wasn't logistical. He failed to find it, and left. Seraphel looked at the closed door for a long moment. Then she ate the bread, because she needed her energy, and returned to the window. Draven's court was not subtle in its disdain. The lichen nobility of Duskfang Hold had a particular way of looking at her, or rather, of looking past her, of allowing their eyes to slide across the space she occupied, as though she were a piece of furniture of questionable taste that the Alpha had inexplicably installed in their great hall. In the communal evening meals, she sat at Draven's right hand and was spoken across as though she were deaf. The pack elders debated border policy, winter hunting rights, and the escalating territorial pressure from the northeast, with total disregard for her presence. She absorbed everything. She had an extraordinary memory, the kind that Orvin had recognized early and ruthlessly exploited in her training. Every detail she heard in that hall, the disputed passes in the northeastern Ashenvale, the names of Draven's patrol captains, the exact count of Duskfang's fighting wolves, was catalogued with the same cold precision she applied to combat geometry. But Draven noticed what his court did not. He noticed when she flinched at a sudden sound, because he was always watching her without appearing to, and he was always interpreting what he saw through the lens of protectiveness rather than suspicion. He began, quietly and without announcement, to manage the environment around her. Blood sparring was moved from the main courtyard to the lower training ground when she was present. Conversations about pack kills were curtailed at the dinner table. Once, a young wolf in his cups began loudly narrating a particularly gruesome border confrontation from 2 winters prior, and Draven cut him off with a single word and a look that made the young man go pale and immediately redirect toward the weather. She watched him do these things and kept her expression at a grateful, overwhelmed flutter, and turned the observation over and over in the cold chamber of her mind, like a stone she couldn't stop examining. He was, she was beginning to reluctantly conclude, a genuinely decent man, in the specific, unsentimental way of someone who held to a personal code, not because it was admired, but because abandoning it would constitute a fundamental failure of self. This was, she recognized with flat pragmatism, a complication. On the night of the first hard frost, 3 weeks into her residence at Duskfang Hold, Seraphel Coldemore did what she had been trained for 16 years to do. She waited until the 3rd bell of night, when the 2nd guard rotation had settled into their posts, and the corridors of the East Tower were empty. She rolled back the heavy rug beside her bed, and lifted the loose stone she had identified on her 6th day, removing the oilcloth bundle she had concealed there on arrival. She unwrapped it in the firelight. A short, dark-handled fighting dagger, with a blade she kept sharp enough to split a candlewick lengthwise, and the sealed leather pouch that contained the letters. She read the letters again, though she had memorized them before she left Coldemore. Her father's seal, unmistakable, pressed in black wax on correspondence, addressed to someone whose name she had been instructed never to speak aloud. Correspondence that outlined, in the careful, euphemistic language of men who knew they were committing treason, the precise terms of a bargain. Corvus Malgrath, Alpha King of the Thornblood Pack, would fracture the peace of the Ashenvale Mountains before the first thaw. He would drive his pack south through the contested northeastern passes, while Duskfang's forces were occupied with the diplomatic pretense of a winter summit. And in Draven Ashcroft's own keep, in his own bed, a quiet blade would ensure the Alpha King did not survive to mount a defense. Earl Brennick Caldermore would receive his river valleys and his uncontested grain trade in the chaos that followed. Corvus Malgrath would receive the mountains, the passes, and the lordship of the north. Seraphel would receive. Her father had implied with the particular tenderness of a man discussing a tool he intended to discard. A quick death rather than a slow one. She folded the letters, replaced them in the pouch, and sat for a long time with her hands flat on her thighs, looking into the fire. She thought about Orvin. She had been 7 years old when her father's men had delivered her to the Ashwick Abbey on the northern coastal cliffs, and she had understood with the absolute clarity of a child who has never been protected that she was being put somewhere out of the way. She was the youngest daughter of a minor earl, and the product of a liaison her father found politically inconvenient to acknowledge. The Abbey was supposed to be where she disappeared, into the grey life of minor religious education and eventual obscurity. Orvin the Hollow had been living in the Abbey's outer grounds for 3 years by the time she arrived, in a converted stable that smelled of salt wind and old leather and the particular sharp mineral oil he used on blades. He was a giant of a man, deep black skin and a shaved head, and a left eye that had been removed at some point in his fighting career and replaced with a disc of hammered bronze that caught the light disconcertingly. He had been a student of the Kashari fighting schools of the Eastern Continent before the Pits had found him, and the Pits had found him for 12 years before a patron with a guilty conscience had bought his freedom and pointed him north. He had not intended to train anyone. He had intended to drink himself quietly to death in the coastal wind. Seraphel had walked into his converted stable on her second day at the Abbey, looked at the weapons racked on the wall with the first genuine interest she had shown in anything since her mother's death the previous year, and said, with the directness of a child who has nothing left to lose, "Will you teach me?" He had laughed. It was, he told her much later, the only time in 12 years that something had genuinely surprised him. He taught her. He was not a gentle teacher, and he was not a forgiving one. He was, however, a completely honest one, which was something Seraphel had never encountered before, and responded to with the ferocious devotion of a person who has been lied to in every direction for their entire life. He taught her that beauty was a weapon, specifically because everyone underestimated it. He taught her that apparent frailty was a weapon, even more powerful than beauty, because it triggered the protective instinct in opponents before combat even began, and made them careless. He taught her how to read a room full of predators and identify the most dangerous one in the first 30 seconds. He taught her that a smaller fighter's survival against a larger opponent depended entirely on geometry, on using the opponent's own mass and momentum and rage against them, on understanding that a giant's reach advantage disappears entirely when you step inside it. He taught her the war falchion. It was not a weapon anyone expected a woman to carry, because it was not considered an elegant weapon. It was a heavy, curved, single-edged blade, brutal and practical, the weapon of executioners and heavy infantry, designed to deliver catastrophic cutting force through dense material. In the hands of someone who understood angular momentum, it was appalling. He taught her that a smaller fighter could generate the same cutting force as a much larger one by understanding exactly how to load kinetic energy through the hips and core, by understanding that the power in a strike did not originate in the arms. For 16 years, the Abbey's outer grounds were her arena, and Orvin the Hollow was her entire world. He died of a fever in the last summer, before her father had summoned her back to Caldermore, a fast and undramatic death that he would have approved of more than any other kind. She had sat with him through the last night, and he had said very little, because he had always communicated most clearly through the precision of physical instruction. But in the grey hour before dawn, he had taken her hand in his enormous one and said, "You are the sharpest thing I ever made, girl. Don't let anyone melt you down for something lesser." She had not wept. He would have found it puzzling. She had, however, kept his bronze eye disc. It was in the oilcloth bundle with the dagger and the letters. She replaced everything in the cavity beneath the stone and lowered the rug back into place. She had come to Duskfang Hold to kill Draven Ashcroft when the moment was tactically optimal. She had spent 4 weeks identifying that optimal moment and finding, with each passing week, a fresh reason why it had not yet arrived. This was a lie she was telling herself, and she was skilled enough at deception to recognize it, even when the target of the deception was her own mind. The truth was that Draven Ashcroft sat across a small table from her at irregular intervals and brought her food with his own hands and watched her with the expression of a man who is trying to protect something he doesn't entirely understand but refuses to stop caring about regardless. And he had said nothing cruel, not once, not even the refined cruelty of polite dismissiveness that she had expected from a man of his power, treating a treaty bride as furniture. He asked her questions, real ones, about the books she read and her opinions on the river trade disputes, and listened to her answers with the focused attention of a man who found people genuinely worth understanding. She did not know what to do with him. She was very good at not knowing what to do with things and continuing to function regardless. She had learned it early. The morning she found confirmation that her father's letters were only part of the picture, she was moving through the lower corridor of the guest quarters during the breakfast hour, when the castle's population was predictably concentrated in the Great Hall. She had been mapping the eastern servant passages, moving with the quiet, unhurried purpose of a woman who appeared to be simply walking without destination, when she heard the voices. 2 of Corvus Malgrath's envoys. They had arrived 6 days prior, under the pretense of preliminary summit arrangements, and they had been given chambers in the lower guest wing. She had been watching them with particular attention. She did not slow her steps. She angled her path to pass closer to the partially open door, and let her face go perfectly blank as she absorbed every word of the conversation inside. 3 weeks. The summit was in 3 weeks. And the thing they were planning was worse than what the letters had outlined, more coordinated, more surgical. Corvus was not simply planning to absorb Duskfang in the chaos following Draven's death. He was planning to blame it on the human bride, to produce a narrative of treachery that would inflame every Lycan pack in the northern territories against the human kingdoms, justifying a wholesale invasion of the river valleys, and eliminating Earl Brennick Caldermore, along with everyone else, once his usefulness as a scapegoat was established. Her father had not understood who he was dealing with. He had thought he was brokering a partnership. He had brokered his own funeral. Seraphel walked on, her steps unhurried, her face pleasant and vacant as a still pond. She returned to her chambers and sat by the window and looked out at the training yard, where 3 of Draven's younger wolves were running forms in the frost, their breath steaming, their movements still rough and improvable. She thought about geometry, about the architecture of a trap, about the specific, cold satisfaction of taking someone else's trap and turning it inside out. And then she went to the Keep's library and spent 4 hours reading every text she could locate on Lycan pack law. She was reading in the Great Hall that evening when Draven returned from the border patrol. She heard him before she saw him, the particular quality of the stir that moved through the hall when he entered, that instinctive collective reorientation of wolves toward their alpha. He came in from the side entrance with 4 of his patrol riders and Thessaly, mud-caked and cold from the mountain ride, and she saw from across the hall that he was moving his right arm with slightly more care than usual. The healer came quickly, and by the firelight Seraphel could see the nature of the wound before the sleeve was rolled back. Parallel lines of deep laceration across the outer forearm. A bear strike, probably a mountain grizzly surprised on the pass. She watched the healer's work with the careful, comprehensive attention she had been giving to everything in this keep for weeks, her embroidery hoop held in her lap as a prop, her eyes making quick, clinical assessments. Werewolf healing was faster than anything described in the human medical texts. She had suspected this from what she had read, but observing it directly was useful confirmation. The deepest of the 4 lacerations began visibly closing within minutes of the wound being cleaned. The healer applied a specific herb pack, dark green, pungent enough that she could identify it from 20 feet as night marrow root, which human herbalists used as an antiseptic in much smaller concentrations. In werewolf physiology, applied in higher concentration directly to an active wound, it appeared to accelerate the healing response dramatically. Draven caught her looking. She had allowed herself to look a fraction of a second too long, distracted by the clinical interest of what she was observing, and his slate-gray eyes found her across the hall, with the directness of a predator who always knew where every living thing in a room was located. She immediately softened her expression into distressed concern, dropped her gaze to her embroidery, and then looked up again with a small, anxious flutter. He crossed the hall to her. "It looks worse than it is," he said, before she could perform the worried inquiry she had been constructing. He glanced at the bandaged arm, with something that might have been mild irritation at the inconvenience. "A bear on the North Pass. Nothing that won't be healed by morning." "I am relieved to hear it," she said, and kept her voice soft, and her hands still in her lap. The hands were the hardest part. Her hands always wanted to assess, to reach out and verify, to do. He sat beside her, which he had not done before in the public hall, and for a moment, he simply looked at her with the expression she could not stop cataloguing. "How was your afternoon?" he asked. It was such a plain, domestic question from a man who had just ridden in bleeding from a bear attack in the mountains, that something about it struck her like a physical impact just below the sternum, sudden and uncomfortable. "I found some remarkable books in the library," she said, which was true. "My great-grandmother was a collector," he said. There was a note of quiet warmth in it. She believed that an alpha who read only military texts would eventually run out of strategies. The library was her argument against that. "She sounds remarkable." She was. He looked at the fire. She was the one who negotiated the first human-lichen boundary accords. She believed the Pax had more to gain from peaceful borders than from endless expansion. Not everyone agreed with her. Seraphel looked at him looking at the fire, and thought about all the things she was not saying, and felt the thing below her sternum tighten another fraction. "She was right," she said quietly. His eyes came back to her. The quality of his attention, when it was fully directed, was extraordinary, not threatening. Simply completely present. "Yes," he said. She was. Corvus Malgrath arrived at Duskfang Hold on a morning so cold that the Ashenvale River had finally frozen entirely, its white silence replacing the constant roar that Seraphel had grown accustomed to. He came with 40 wolves. She counted them from her tower window, methodically, noting the formation, the weapons carried openly, the weapons she could identify concealed beneath winter furs, and the position of Corvus himself at the head of the column. He was larger than she had anticipated, which was notable because she had anticipated large. The accounts of him had not been understating his physical reality. He was built along the lines of a siege engine, heavy and merciless, with a face that collected scars the way other men's faces collected expressions. He rode a black destrier with the specific ease of a man who is accustomed to everything around him being smaller than it would like to be. Even at this distance, across the width of the training yard, she could identify the particular quality of violence in him that distinguished men who enjoyed it from men who simply employed it. Corvus Malgrath enjoyed it. She stepped back from the window and went to her trunk and removed the gown she intended to wear to the evening feast. It was midnight blue, which she had selected deliberately. Against her pallor and the dark of her braided hair, she knew precisely how she looked in it. Fragile and decorative, an ornament at a powerful man's table. She dressed with the unhurried focus of someone preparing for a specific kind of combat, and went down to the great hall. The feast was everything she had anticipated, and worse. Corvus Malgrath sat at the opposite head of the great oak table from Draven, 40 of his wolves arranged along the benches to his left and right, and he ate with the deliberate, performative voracity of a man who wanted every person in the room to watch him consume things. He was louder than the 40 men around him combined. He dominated the acoustic space of the hall, the way he had dominated the courtyard on arrival, as though the entire environment existed primarily to provide context for him. He ignored her for the first hour. She had expected this. It was a strategic ignoring, designed to make the moment when he chose to notice her more pointed. When he finally turned his dark eyes to her, she was lifting her goblet of spiced wine and watching nothing in particular, with a pleasantly vacant expression. "So," Corvus said, his voice cutting across the table conversations with the blunt force of a dropped millstone. "This is the human bride." She allowed her eyes to move to him slowly, as though roused from a comfortable interior distance, and offered him a small, uncertain smile. "Lord Malgrath," she said softly, "I hope the journey from the northeastern territories was not too arduous." It was the exact tone of a woman attempting polite conversation out of dutiful nervousness, and it was perfect. Corvus looked at her for a long moment, with the frank appraisal of a man examining livestock he has not decided to purchase, and smiled, a thing that reached none of the relevant parts of his face. "You are smaller than your father's letter suggested," he said. Though I confess his letter suggested very little. Draven set his goblet down with a measured care that she recognized as the external expression of a man applying force of will to stay seated. "Lord Malgrath," Draven said, with a quietness that was considerably more dangerous than volume, "my mate is not the subject of this summit." "No," Corvus agreed pleasantly. "She is merely the symbol of it. The symbol of a great Lycan alpha, choosing political convenience over the law of the blood." He reached out and tore a piece of meat from the platter in front of him with his bare hands, unhurried. The packs of the north looked to Duskfang as their example. "Ashcroft, what example do you set when you take a trembling human girl to your bed instead of a worthy wolf-blooded mate? You tell them that weakness is acceptable, that frailty is sufficient." His eyes moved back to Seraphel with a smile that made the warmth of the great hall feel considerably more distant. "No offense intended to your charming ornament." The hall was very quiet. Seraphel felt Draven beside her, the controlled heat of barely contained fury, and kept her own face at a perfect, wide-eyed, slightly confused expression, as though she were still processing whether she had been insulted. "I invoke," Corvus said, and his voice dropped to a register that fell across the room like a stone into still water, "the right of the bonded flame." The silence that followed was of a different quality than the quiet before it. It was the silence of people who had just heard an event begin that could not be stopped. Seraphel watched the pack elders react. The eldest, a wolf with white hair and eyes the color of old amber, went still in the particular way of someone trying to find a technical objection and not locating one. The right of the bonded flame was the oldest law in the Lycan Accords. It existed in the original stone carvings in the lower vault of every ancient Lycan hold, the foundational laws of the pack system carved before any human Lycan treaty had ever been contemplated. It held that if a visiting alpha, in the presence of pack witnesses, formally declared that a bonded alpha's chosen mate was of insufficient quality to hold the bond, physically, spiritually, or in terms of direct blood strength, and could demonstrate specific grounds, the challenged mate was required to answer by combat, or the alpha conceded the declaration by default. Default meant abdication. "The grounds," demanded Thessaly, who was on her feet before Seraphel had fully processed the invocation, one hand on the hilt of the short blade at her hip. "State your specific grounds, Malgrath." Corvus gestured at Seraphel, with the patience of a man who has already won an argument and is performing the formality of finishing it. She is visibly trembling. She flinched twice during the serving of the meat course. She cannot meet the direct gaze of any wolf in this hall for longer than 4 seconds. He looked at the elders. I name her unfit on grounds of blood cowardice. A bonded alpha's mate must be of sufficient fiber to stand beside him in crisis. This creature cannot stand in the same room. You will not, Draven said, and his voice had descended to something below his chest, something resonant and absolute. Put your hands on my mate. I am not proposing to put my hands on her, Corvus replied. He stood. At his full height, even across the length of the oak table, he was an impressive and oppressive thing. I am proposing to put my hands on her in the dueling ring at noon tomorrow, as the ancient rite specifies, in fair combat, before the witnesses of both packs. She may accept, or you may concede, at which point the ancient law provides that your bond is dissolved, your title is forfeit, and Duskfang Hold falls under the governance of the challenging alpha. He spread his hands in a gesture of theatrical reasonableness. I am simply a man who loves the old laws. Step forward, the white-haired elder said, his voice carrying the toneless weight of ritual. Draven Ashcroft, do you contest the invocation? Draven was on his feet. She could feel the waves of controlled fury coming off him like heat off forged stone. And beneath the fury, something else. Something she recognized from the way he moved toward her whenever he thought she might be frightened. I will fight in her stead, he said, his voice tight. The law is explicit, the elder said, and there was genuine sorrow in it. A proxy fight is a default concession. The challenged mate must answer, or the title falls. Draven looked down at her. She could see everything that was happening in his face. The calculation and the rage and the desperate protective instinct that had been building for weeks. All of it stripped bare in this moment by the extremity of the situation. She saw him reach the conclusion. She saw him accept it. I will step down, he said, quietly and absolutely. I will take you south, Seraphel. Tonight, if you are willing. I care nothing for the title, if the alternative is your death. The hall reacted in a sharp collective intake of breath. 40 Duskfang wolves stared at their alpha, and in their faces she could see the full spectrum of responses. Awe, shock, fury, grief. Corvus Malgrath laughed, a sound like stone grinding on stone. Seraphel looked at Draven's face. She looked at the absolute sincerity in it. This was not strategy. This was not political calculation. This was a man who had spent his entire adult life defined by his title and his pack and his ancestral hold, and he was offering to walk away from every piece of it because the alternative was watching her die. For 16 years, she had been a function, a weapon, a message delivered in flesh. Orvin had loved her, in his way, the way a craftsman loves the finest thing he has ever made, which is real love, but also a love with conditions built into its architecture. Her father had never pretended otherwise. Every person who had known her had known a specific version of her that served a specific purpose. Draven Ashcroft had known only the fiction. He had treated the fiction with sincerity, and he was now willing to sacrifice everything for the fiction's well-being. She wondered, very briefly, what he would do when he discovered the truth. She stood up. She reached up and unclasped the midnight blue cloak from her shoulders and let it fall to the bench behind her. Beneath it, she wore what she had worn every day, beneath every gown since her arrival. A close-fitted tunic of dark, supple leather over linen, with reinforced panels across the ribcage, and riding breeches that allowed full mobility in every direction. She heard the sounds the hall made when she stood in this. She heard the confused murmur, and then the sharpening attention, as the wolves registered that this was not the body of a fragile woman. The leather showed the reality of her arms and shoulders, the density of the muscle there, the way she carried her weight, settled and even, and ready. She turned to face Corvus Malgrath. She allowed the last piece of the performance to fall away, the uncertain eyes, the flickering lower lip, the slightly hunched, self-protective posture. All of it dropped in a single moment of deliberate release, like setting down a bag of stones, and she stood in the quality of stillness that Orvin had spent 16 years building in her, the stillness of a blade at rest. The hall made no sound at all. Corvus Malgrath was looking at her with the first genuine assessment he had directed at her all evening. She noted the flicker of recalibration in his face and assigned it the weight it deserved: minimal. He was still enormous. He was still a partial shift Lycan Alpha with 30 years of brutal combat experience. The recalibration in his face was curiosity, not concern. It did not matter what he felt. It only mattered what she did. "I accept the right," Seraphel said. Her voice, unmodified, unrehearsed, rang out across the hall with a clarity and a coldness that made several of the assembled wolves sit straighter without appearing to intend to. Tomorrow at noon, in the outer courtyard, before the witnesses of both packs. She let the small silence breathe, and then she looked at Corvus Malgrath with the specific quality of attention she reserved for things she intended to kill. "But I add one term to the ancient rite," she said. "If I prevail, the Thornblood Pack does not swear fealty to Duskfang Hold. The Thornblood Pack swears fealty to me." She spent the night doing what she had always done before combat. She slept for 4 hours, perfectly and completely, in the way Orvin had trained her to sleep, the way soldiers and predators slept before necessary violence, without sentiment, without anticipation, with the simple pragmatic understanding that the body required maintenance. She rose at the third bell of morning and moved through her forms in the darkness of her chamber by firelight, the full sequence of the Kashari 12, slow and absolute, feeling every joint and muscle report its readiness. Then she dressed, braided her hair flat against her skull, and opened the trunk. Grey Marrow had travelled from the Ashwick Abbey to Caldemore under a false bottom in her clothing chest, wrapped in 3 layers of oiled canvas. It was a war falchion of the old Eastern pattern, with a blade of dark folded steel that curved in the specific way designed to maximize draw-cutting force, the edge geometry of an instrument designed not for dueling, but for the efficient conclusion of violent situations. The hilt was plain, wound with copper wire, sized for large hands, and fitted with a heavy iron pommel that had a secondary function she had demonstrated twice in her life and hoped not to require today. The blade bore no name from its maker, but she had given it one, because Orvin had told her that a weapon with a name was a weapon you were honest with about what it was. Grey Marrow, because it went to the bone. She honed the edge for 20 minutes with a whetstone, not because it needed it, but because the rhythm of it was useful, and felt the familiar cold quiet settle into her chest, the place where most people experienced fear, and she experienced clarity. Draven knocked on her door at first light. She opened it. He stood in the corridor with the look of a man who had not slept and had spent the hours building an argument. And he saw her, the leather tunic, the braided hair, the war falchion resting against the wall beside the door, and his mouth did a thing it hadn't done before in her presence. It went entirely still, not from blankness, but from something she could not immediately categorize. Seraphel. His voice was careful. "Draven, you do not have to do this." He said it with everything he had. She could hear it. "There are other options. I can challenge him on the grounds of procedural bad faith in the summit. It will take time, but the elders will not override a clean invocation, and you know it." She stepped back from the door, and he entered, his eyes moving over the room, over the trunk with its revealed contents, over the things that could not be explained by the fiction of the frightened human bride. "Sit down, Draven." He sat, because she had asked him to, which was not nothing. She stood across the room from him and thought about how to be truthful in the most useful order. "I am not what you think I am," she said. "I am beginning to understand that," he said carefully. "I was trained," she said, "for 16 years, by a Kashari fighting master. My father arranged it, not out of care for me, but because he needed an instrument precise enough to accomplish something a soldier could not." She watched his face. "I was sent here to secure the treaty. I was also sent here, If the political situation deteriorated in the way my father anticipated, to ensure that Duskfang had no alpha to defend it. The silence in the room changed quality. Your father, Draven said very quietly, sent you to kill me. Yes. He absorbed this. She watched him absorb it with the particular quality of attention she had given everything in this keep, analyzing for reaction, for danger, for the shift toward violence, that any reasonable person in his position might feel. What she saw was more complicated than she had prepared for. And yet, he said, here we are. Yes. Why? She had thought about this. She had thought about it with the same cold precision she applied to combat geometry, looking for the truest answer that could be stated clearly, because she owed him that. Because my father sent a weapon, and what he produced was a person, she said. And a person can choose. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, what did Malgrath offer him? The river valleys. Uncontested passage. He intended to eliminate my father afterward, once he was no longer useful. She paused. He intends to blame your death on me, to use the human bride's treachery as justification for open war against the human kingdoms. Something moved in Draven's face that she had not seen before. It was cold and absolute, and considerably more frightening than his anger. Then we end this today, he said. Yes, she agreed. He stood, and he crossed the room, and he stopped in front of her close enough that she had to adjust her chin to maintain eye contact. And he looked at her with all the things she had been cataloguing for weeks. The protectiveness, and the pity, and the warmth. But beneath all of it now, something new. Are you going to win? He asked. She considered giving him the honest, probabilistic assessment. She considered the variables, Corvus's size, his partial shift capability, his experience, her own edge in technique and strategy, and the critical factor that he expected nothing from her, and expectation gaps were the most exploitable vulnerabilities in any opponent. Yes, she said. Good, he said. Then I will be at the ring's edge, and I will be watching. The courtyard of Duskfang Hold at noon held more people than she had thought it could contain. They covered every wall walk and every available inch of the inner yard. Duskfang wolves and Thornblood wolves, the lines between them already blurring in the collective anticipation of violence, because whatever else divided the packs, bloodsport was a shared language. The cold was profound, the sky above the black granite walls a featureless pale grey, and the ground of the dueling ring had been cleared of snow to reveal frozen dark earth. She walked out through the iron portcullis with Greymarrow resting across her left shoulder, and felt the sound change in the courtyard when they saw her. She had expected mockery. She got something that took her a moment to identify. The specific, collective silence of predators, confronted with something they cannot immediately categorize. She stepped into the center of the ring and assumed her guard. Greymarrow angled in a high middle position, her weight settled, her breathing slow. Corvus came out to the sound of his pack's approval. A harsh and rhythmic thing, 40 wolves expressing confidence in their alpha. He was already partially shifted, the tendons in his neck thickening, his hands elongating into the curved talons that could open a man's ribcage with a single strike. He was armored in his own mass, and had apparently judged that sufficient. He looked at her in the center of the ring, and she saw him make the calculation. She was roughly a third of his body weight. She held a weapon that was impressive for a human, but whose leverage advantage against his density and reach he appeared to be assessing as negligible. He had 30 years of combat experience against opponents who had been trying to kill him, which meant he had 30 years of successful survival, which meant he was not incompetent. He was also, she noted, looking at her with the particular contempt of a man who is performing confidence for an audience. There was something beneath it. She had put it there last night when she had dropped the performance. It was small, but it was there. Good. Human bride, Corvus said, loud enough for the walls. He spread his arms, a showman's gesture. I respect the courage it takes to stand here. When this is over, I will remember your name. You won't. she said simply. Not loudly, just to him. She saw his jaw tighten. The elder's call came from the wall above. The rite of the bonded flame is witnessed. Begin. Corvus moved with the speed that had apparently ended the lives of everyone else who had faced him in this context. Explosive and immediate, closing the 15 feet between them in 2 massive strides. His right arm swept out in a horizontal arc aimed at her neck, talons extended. A blow designed not to cut, but to smash. To catch her with the raw kinetic impact of a limb that weighed more than her entire torso. She was not there. She had dropped her center of gravity and pivoted left on her back heel in the half-second before impact, rolling out of the swing's path, letting it pass over her. The miss carried his mass forward fractionally. Just enough. The cliff edge of imbalance that only existed for a fraction of a second in a fighter of his experience. But Orvin had spent 3 years teaching her to find that fraction of a second and live inside it. She brought Grey Marrow around in a tight rising arc and opened a deep line across his right forearm. The sound he made was not a sound of pain. It was a sound of offended astonishment. He looked at his arm, and the blood there, with the expression of a man who has dropped something he had been certain was properly secured. He came again, faster, angrier, both hands now, a series of alternating strikes that required her to keep moving, to stay ahead of his reach, and redirect where she couldn't avoid. She was not blocking his strength with her own. That was a fight she would lose in the first exchange. She was redirecting, angling the flat of Grey Marrow against the side of incoming strikes, to turn them rather than absorb them, keeping her footwork tight and economical, staying in the places he was not. He hit her in the 4th exchange. It was a glancing blow, the back of his left hand catching her across the shoulder and upper chest as she was completing a redirect, and the impact was sufficient to knock her backward 4 steps and send white light across her vision. She caught her footing and spat blood from where her teeth had caught the inside of her cheek, felt the sharp assessment of her ribs, bruised but not broken. The leather had absorbed the worst of it. She reset her grip on Grey Marrow. The courtyard reacted, a surge of sound. Draven's voice, from the ring's edge, was a single sharp word that carried through the noise with absolute authority. She didn't turn to look at him. Corvus saw her spit blood, and something in him shifted. She had expected it. Rage was predictable in men who were accustomed to winning, men for whom the sight of their opponent's blood was a conclusion rather than a development. The rage made them faster and stronger, and significantly less intelligent, which was the only direction in which she could afford him to move. He roared and committed fully, both arms driving downward in an overhead smash aimed at her skull. The totality of his mass and force concentrated in a single terminal strike. She sidestepped right. His fists hit the frozen earth and cracked it, chunks of dark ice flying, and the impact reverberated through the ground under her boots. And his neck was there, fully extended, the line of it exposed from his left ear to his collarbone, in the perfect geometry of an overextended overhead strike. She planted her lead foot. She loaded from the ground up, the way Orvin had shown her 1,000 times. The push from the earth, through the soles, up through the legs, hip torque, core, shoulders, arms. The full kinetic chain of a human body, translating ground force into blade velocity. Everything she was, and everything she had been, made into concentrated, into the angular momentum of Grey Marrow's arc. The blade sang in the cold air. The blow struck precisely where she had aimed it. The sound was not like any sound that had preceded it in the courtyard. The courtyard of Duskfang Hold was silent in the way that places are silent after something irreversible has occurred. Not peaceful silence. Not the silence of contentment or rest. The silence of a world that has just been rearranged and has not yet decided what it is. Seraphel stood in the center of the ring. She breathed. Her ribs ached with a deep, percussive intensity. Her shoulder would be spectacular shades of color by morning. She was standing, which was what mattered. She reached to her belt and withdrew the linen cloth she had placed there, before descending to the courtyard. She cleaned Greymarrow with the methodical thoroughness of someone who respected their tools. She sheathed the blade. She looked at the kneeling second-in-command of the Thornblood pack, a scarred older wolf who had gone to his knees in the snow 2 seconds after the silence began, his eyes fixed on the ground, his neck bent in the posture of absolute submission. Her voice was level and reached every corner of the courtyard without effort. The blood rite is concluded. By the laws your ancestors wrote and Corvus Malgrath invoked in this yard at noon. Thornblood's fealty follows victory. You know this. We know it, the second-in-command said, his voice rough. Lady, you will address me correctly, she said. Not harshly, simply with the precision of someone establishing terms that would not be revisited. I am Luna, of Duskfang Hold, and Blood Conqueror of Thornblood, by ancient right. What I am called reflects that. Yes, my Luna, he said. The other Thornblood wolves dropped to their knees in the snow. Draven was inside the ring. She had not registered him crossing the barrier, but he was there, 3 feet in front of her, and whatever she had expected from him in this moment, it was not what his face was doing. It was not the awe, though the awe was there. It was not the confusion, though that was there too. It was something she had very little experience being on the receiving end of. He was looking at her the way she had seen him look at the fortress, at the mountains, at things that were permanent features of the world he had built his life around, with a recognition that had weight in it. Seraphel, he said. I owe you a full accounting, she said. Everything. My father's letters, the arrangement with Malgrath, the full scope of what I was sent here to do. She held his gaze. I will give you all of it. Whatever you do with it is your right. I know what I'll do with it, he said. He stepped forward. His hand came up and rested with extraordinary gentleness against the side of her face, the specific quality of touch she recognized from all the small, careful gestures he had made in the past weeks, adjusted now for the reality of what she was, rather than the fiction of what he had believed her to be, and somehow no less careful for the adjustment. You protected me, he said. Yes. When you had every reason not to. Yes. Why? He was asking again. Not because he hadn't heard her earlier, because the answer mattered enough to ask twice. She thought about Orvan, about the bronze eye disc in the oilcloth bundle under the stone, about 16 years of being made into the sharpest thing, and the moment she had decided that being sharp was not the same as being pointed at whatever direction you were handed, because a weapon that chooses its purpose, she said quietly, is not a weapon anymore. Something shifted in his expression, completed itself. Behind them, Thessaly's voice rang out across the courtyard, clear and absolute as a blade drawn in cold air. All hail the Luna of Duskfang. She did not kneel immediately. Thessaly was not a woman who did anything immediately. She looked at Seraphel with the amber eyes that had assessed her like livestock on the day of her arrival, and what was in them now was something that had no kneeling required to be understood. Then she knelt. The cry took up through the Duskfang wolves, a deep, rhythmic sound, hands striking chests, and then, ragged at first and then finding its timing, the Thornblood wolves added their voices. Draven stepped back 1 pace and dropped to 1 knee in the snow, his head bowed, and took her calloused right hand in both of his and pressed his lips to her knuckles. The gesture was both ritual and personal, and she felt it as both. My Luna, he said, my queen. She presented the letters in the great hall that evening, before the assembled witnesses of both packs and the 3 pack elders who constituted the legal body of Lycan law. She laid them on the table without ceremony and summarized their contents with the flat, comprehensive precision of someone who has had 16 years to practice leaving her feelings out of things she had to do. The elders read. The hall listened. The silence was different from any of the silences that had preceded it. The silence of a collective understanding forming, a new shape of the political world being grasped. Earl Brennick Caldemore, the white-haired elder said, when he had finished, has violated the foundational accords of human-Lycan coexistence and conspired in the attempted murder of a sovereign alpha. Under joint law, the treaty between House Caldemore and Duskfang Hold is dissolved. Yes, said Seraphel, and replaced. She laid a second document on the table. She had written it herself, in the library, 3 days after finding the evidence of Malgrath's extended plan. She had written it with the specific legal knowledge she had been quietly acquiring from the Keep's law texts, and she had written it knowing that if the morning of the duel went correctly, she would be in a position to present it. It was not a treaty. It was a declaration of the United Territories of Duskfang and Thornblood, operating under a single consolidated governance, with a clear legal framework for the human river valleys that removed House Caldemore from the equation entirely and established direct trade relations with the consolidated Lycan territory under terms that would be considerably more beneficial to the human villages and farming communities than anything her father had ever negotiated on their behalf. Draven read it beside her. She watched his face move through it. "You wrote this before the duel," he said quietly. "Before, yes. While you were reading the law texts in the library, yes." He looked at her with the expression she was beginning to be able to identify and still found impossible to categorize neatly, though she had been trying. "You were planning beyond the duel," he said. "A blade that only accounts for the next second is a blade that loses the fight," she said. "Orvin told me that." "Who was Orvin?" "The man who made me," she said. "In the best sense I know how to mean that." Draven was quiet for a moment. "I would like to hear about him, when you are willing." It was such a plain thing to say, such a wholly uncalculated expression of genuine interest in the shape of who she was, and how she had come to be it, that it struck her in the same place below the sternum as his question about her afternoon had, weeks ago. "Yes," she said, which was not a word she used carelessly. The night settled over Duskfang Hold, cold and clear, the stars hard and bright above the black peaks of the Ashenvale Mountains. The Thornblood wolves made their camp in the outer yard, under the watchful arrangement of Thessaly's assignment, and there was the low murmur of an order in the process of reconfiguring itself into something new. In the Keep's great hall, the fire burned down to coals, and the two packs sat at a single table, without the division of their arrival, talking in the low, practical register of people who are beginning to negotiate a shared future. Seraphel sat at the head of the table, which was where the Luna sat, and she thought about geometry, about how a straight line between two fixed points was not always the shortest route when there were obstacles between them, about how sometimes you had to load the kinetic energy from an entirely unexpected direction in order to strike the target precisely enough to matter, about how she had traveled the longest route imaginable from a coastal abbey at the edge of the world to this seat, and how the route had passed through 16 years of pain and purpose, and the loss of the only person who had ever purely loved the truest version of her, and how it had deposited her, against every calculation, at a table in a Wolf King's fortress at the edge of the mountains, with a man sitting at her right hand who had looked at the fiction of her and been willing to give up everything to protect it, and now looked at the truth of her with something that she was going to have to find a word for eventually. She thought she had some time. The winter was long in the Ashenvale Mountains. Draven's hand rested on the table beside hers, close but not presuming. She looked at it for a moment. Then she turned her palm over, and his fingers curled around hers with the same careful, permanent quality of a man who, once committed, did not revise. Outside, the wind came down off the peaks and swept through the battlements of Duskfang Hold, carrying the cold, clean smell of pine and snow and the long distances of the north. And below, in the outer yard, the wolves of two rival packs sat in the firelight of a shared fire, and the new world that a human woman had built in a single afternoon with a heavy blade and 16 years of invisible work began its first quiet night of existence. It would, she thought, be sufficient. It would, in fact, be considerably more than that. The tale of the Luna of Duskfang did not remain confined to the mountains. It moved the way true things move, not with the loud velocity of rumors, but with the quiet inexorability of water finding its level, spreading through the trading posts and river towns of the human kingdoms and the packed territories of the north, until it had saturated the understanding of an entire generation. In the years that followed, when the human lords of the river valleys sat at their negotiating tables and calculated the risk of territorial ambition, they calculated it differently than their fathers had. They calculated it with the knowledge that the consolidated Lycan territory of the Ashenvale was governed jointly by a king who had never lost a military campaign and a queen who had never lost a fight, and that the queen had started from a position most people would not have survived at all. The porcelain bride had turned out not to be porcelain. She had turned out to be the thing that porcelain breaks against.